Hello and welcome everyone to our newest installment of Office Hours with Dr. John Kelly. Today we have a very distinguished guest in Dr. Jack Naglieri, and today he's going to talk to us about a social justice approach to identifying gifted students. As we move on, wanted to go over today's agenda. And with that, we've just got a brief introduction. We've got some housekeeping items to go along with that, but then we'll hopefully jump into the presentation. I've reviewed it. It's going to be chock full of great and useful information. So we've got a quick presentation, and then we'll jump into the discussion with Dr. Kelly and Dr. Naglieri. And at the very end, we'll have questions and answer. And so I want to remind everyone to make sure that you put your questions in the chat as you have them in real time, regardless of where we are in the presentation or discussion. Put your questions in the chat because we're going to go back to them, and we're going to go back to them and go through them in order. One other quick reminder for those of you who have some kind of hearing impairment, we do have closed captioning. All you have to do is enable live transcription at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the menu. So make sure you click on that. We will be recording this presentation and uploading it to our servers and YouTube later. So if you can't catch all of it, we will be providing a link to the recording. So I want to remind you all of that. At any rate, we are eLuma. We provide mental health supports and special education solutions, and we service all throughout the country. We're here to help you. Whether you're a clinician, whether you're an administrator, whether you're an educator of any kind, we're here to service your students. And at the same time, we love to be involved in these kind of conversations. I love to talk to people like Dr. Naglieri and Dr. Kelly. So much to learn from these kinds of gentlemen. And obviously, we're doing a lot of these webinars. And so if you're interested in these kinds of things, please follow us on Twitter at elumatherapy.com or Facebook. facebook.com/elumatherapy/. Here you can stay up to date on all of the latest and greatest with our webinars, content, and everything else. And of course, we always invite you, if you ever need help, to learn more about us. You can find us at eLuma.com. So without any further ado, we'd love to turn this over to Dr. John Kelly.
Well, thank you so much, George. Welcome back to those of you who have been with us in previous office hours with Dr. John Kelly. If this is your first office hours with me, I am John Kelly, your host for this afternoon. I am thrilled to be hosting this series of conversations. There are big ideas within the field of school psychology, within the field of education, a variety of different friends and professionals that will be joining me for these conversations. So I want to welcome you back or welcome you to Office Hours with Dr. John Kelly. Tonight, I am excited. I have a good friend, a colleague, a true legend within the field of school psychology, Dr. Jack Naglieri. I like to refer to Dr. Naglieri as the godfather of assessment within school psychology. You'll understand shortly as Jack and I kind of launch into conversation about some big ideas. But tonight I'm excited because Jack's going to talk about an area that we often don't talk too much about, and it's really equitable access to gifted education or enriched programs for all students. And I know that Dr. Naglieri has done some amazing work. He's going to talk about some of the big ideas at first, and then we're going to launch into a little bit of conversation. We do welcome your thoughts, your questions throughout the presentation. As George said, please put your questions within the chat box. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So without further ado, let me turn over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jack Naglieri. Jack, it's all you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, George. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and especially it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about gifted identification with my dear friend John Kelly. We've spoken a lot about this topic in other places, but it's really great to do it in this context. Couple of things. On this first image, you can see my email. I welcome hearing from you today, and I welcome hearing from you in the future. Feel free to email me. You can also go to my website, jacknaglieri.com, and more specifically for my work in the gifted area, go to naglierigiftedtests.com. Both of those sites are completely free, and there's tremendous amount of information there for you. So if you want to know more about what we're going to talk about today, go to those two places. Of course, it's always important to talk about disclosures. These are some of the books and tests that I've published over the years, and I'm sure I'll mention many of these as we go through. Oh, and here are the two websites. So yeah, everything that you want to know really is in these websites, including links to my YouTube channel that has tons of videos, tons of presentations that I've given with other people, such as Tulio Otero, Dina Buyes, Kim Lansdowne, co-authors with me on various tests. But I want to ask you a few questions. Did you ever wonder or think about why does an intelligence test like the WISC have a vocabulary subtest? Isn't that what you learn in school? And similarities, that's just simple word analogies, really. And general information, isn't that what you learn in school? And an arithmetic word problem subtest? Why should that be used to measure intelligence? And why does for example, the WJ have a oral vocabulary test on the part of the test that's supposed to measure intelligence, and a vocabulary test that's supposed to measure on the version of the WJ that measures achievement? If that makes you have a funny feeling in your gut, you should listen to that, because it doesn't make sense to me. Now, what relevance does this have for non-biased and equitable assessment? Test content is the way you determine if a test is equitable, even if it's non-biased. And what responsibility do you have as a school psychologist or an educator or a consumer or a teacher who is given information about a student? You need to understand in a deeper level the profound weakness of traditional IQ and the way in which they've misled us to understand individual students and groups of people. To give you just a little bit of background, most people don't understand, don't know that the WISC, the COGAT, the OLSAT, a lot of what's on the WJ, for example, these so-called new tests, a WISC 5 editions, they all go back to the original work of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The Army Alpha and Beta were actually made in the early 1900s and officially released in 1917. And Wexler was a military examiner, and all he did was take what was in the Army Alpha and the Army Beta and make it into an individually administered test. And if you go and read Army Mental Test, you can see whose book I've made a copy of the image here. If you go back and read Army Mental Test, you'll see the Wexler scales there. Interestingly, if you read on page 19 of that book, Yoakum and Yerkes explicitly wrote that men who fail in alpha, the verbal, are sent to beta, the nonverbal, in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. So they knew that having test questions that demanded knowledge was problematic, but they did it anyway. And Rudolf Pintner, who was an advocate of so-called nonverbal tests in 1923, he wrote, a good intelligence test must avoid anything that's commonly learned. In a broad sense, this rests on the differentiation between intelligence and knowledge. If you look across all these different tests, they all are embedded with knowledge. And this really is a problem. What's the problem? Well, here it is. This particular slide, so to speak, this image, this collection of research is in this book that we will publish on October 4th this year, Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests, a call for equity in gifted education. That's what we're about. And why are we doing this? Because look at the top part of the image. Otis Lennon, Stanford Binet, WISC 5, WJ, Kogat, WISC 5 again. 9 to 12 point differences by race and ethnicity. But then let's look at the bottom. These are tests that have minimal knowledge. The KBC, the CAS, my NNAT, my nonverbal, and then my 3 new tests. Well, the differences between race and ethnicity there are like 3 to 4 points. So what does this tell us? This tells us that these traditional tests with their knowledge components yield large differences by race and ethnicity, but tests that were made in such a way that they don't rely on knowledge yield much smaller. So even though a test may not show psychometric test bias, statement on the bottom there, those tests with academic content that show large mean score differences, those are not equitable and they are unfair. You will hear people say to you, well, the WISC doesn't have test bias. Well, that's what we call psychometric test bias, meaning how the test itself works within itself. But equity is about the content of the questions. So if a person, according to the standards, if a person has limited opportunity to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because you're just penalizing a person who hasn't had opportunity to learn and then saying they're not that smart. They don't deserve to be gifted. And that's not right. So I just told you something really big, and I just need to pause and reflect on this quote from Maya Angelou. We do the best we can with what we know. But when we know better, we do better. And what I'm trying to do today is show this research that I've found, some of it mine, some of it others, that inform us about a problem with tests that we would probably call gold standards that simply aren't. Now, here's the crux of the issue, so to speak. If you look at the tests most often used to identify gifted children, 5 out of the 6 tests most often used demand knowledge. The only one that doesn't demand knowledge is my Naglieri nonverbal ability test. Well, what kind of impact does that have on our field? Well, I became really interested in trying to quantify how many people out there should be gifted but weren't. And I just went to sources for the US public schools and was able to calculate the difference between how many students were in public school, potentially gifted, actually in gifted, and the difference between those two. So, for example, whites overrepresented, Blacks underrepresented by almost 300,000, Hispanics by a little more than 500,000, Native Americans, and those of two or more races, a total of 873,000 students in K through 12 who are smart enough to be in gifted, but weren't. And I used the conservative score of 92nd percentile. According to the NAGC, they talk about 8 to 10% of the population being gifted. I just took the lower number. And if you look just at ELL students, as another 250,000 students. And of course, that overlaps a little bit with the first group that I showed you. But interestingly, those numbers need to be actually considered in light of the fact that only about 60% of schools actually evaluate for gifted students. So if we add another 40%, it brings the number up to 1.2 million. So we're talking about, let's just say 1 million kids, 1 million smart, wonderful people who are Black, who are Hispanic, who are learning English, who are Native Americans, Alaskan students, who are really smart, and they deserve a place in gifted, but they've been denied that. This is the foundation of the tests that I've created with my two colleagues, Dina Bruyes and Kim Lansdowne. What we did here is we said, let's build tests that were explicitly designed to be equitable. And how would we go about doing that? Well, we're going to use the traditional verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative formats to measure general ability. In other words, we're not measuring verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence and quantitative intelligence. Those things do not exist. We measure general ability using verbal content, nonverbal content, and quantitative content. So what did we do? We have test questions that do not require academic knowledge. We have verbal and quantitative tests, questions that can be solved using any language. I'll show you what it looks like. We use animated instructions. I'll show you that as well. Multiple choice response means the student doesn't have to articulate his or her answer. And we have flexible online, and we're using universal assessment with local and national norms. Here's the essence of what we're trying to achieve. We want to measure thinking in a way that's not confounded by knowing. So whenever you look at a test question or the work that a student does, you should always ask these two questions. What does the student need to know to complete the task? That would indicate that the task involves knowledge, obviously. How does the student have to think? That's when you're getting at the intelligence part of it. So when we talk about thinking, that's how we measure intelligence. And we have to do it in a way that's not confounded by what the student knows. Here's I'm going to show you an example from the 3 tests, the verbal, the nonverbal, and the quantitative. And first, I'm going to show you how the directions work, hopefully. Okay, so the students watch this video. Thought bubble. Zoom in. Oh. Those things over here. Oh, yeah. That's fruit. A chair is not a piece of fruit. Like, for example, on a COGAT, try giving a COGAT to first graders or kindergartners, and when you finish reading the huge paragraph of directions, and you look at your kids, the kids are all over the place because they don't understand it and they can't listen to a whole paragraph of instructions. And it's filled with verbal concepts and on and on. It's absurd. That's what we've been doing. Now, sorry, I lost. Okay, here's where I need to come back here. So this example at the top of the page, this is, if you look at it, I'll give you just a second to look at it. Think about, okay, so which answer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 doesn't go with the others? Well, you might look, well, look, 2 of them have handles. One of them can be closed. Maybe that's the answer. That's actually a distractor. We have 2 like bowls. Oh, wait, they're all empty except number 2. Now, you can say that in any language, right? Or you could not even look at it. You know, you might look at it and immediately say, oh, it's things that are open. That's how we measure verbal conceptual thinking in any language. Now, the nonverbal test, middle here, this is like my original Naglieri nonverbal, but what I did for this edition is I made it really cool. I added a lot of new kinds of matrices and really fun stuff. And then the third is the quantitative. The quantitative is very simple math, simple math, not math knowledge. Like, for example, this is a simple sequence, right? But I wouldn't put a Fibonacci series there because the student who knows math would recognize that Fibonacci series and get it right away. So we wouldn't do that, right? So it's not academic knowledge. It's just very, very basic reasoning with numbers. And there's a lot of different items. There are a lot of different kinds of items here, but we're not showing them because we don't want, for test security reasons. Okay, now here's the amazing thing. When I showed you that image with all the different intelligence tests there, these are the data for the Naglieri general ability test. But I want to talk to you about this for a second because it's very important. As a researcher, one of the things that I always want to do is replicate. Because you can do a study and get a good result, but you need to replicate it and replicate it. My intervention research is like that. We have 6 or 7 studies. Replication is the key to really understanding what you found. So we are arguing that if you take the knowledge out of the traditional ability tests, that would solve the equity problem. Well, that's what we've done here. We have a verbal and nonverbal and quantitative. That's traditional general ability content. So we have 2,500 approximately kids who got the verbal test, 36 who got the nonverbal, and almost 3,000 who got the quantitative test. Each sample represents the US population, K to 12. What did we find? No gender difference, no race difference, no ethnic difference, and amazingly, no parental education level differences. We found the same result 3 times. This is an incredibly powerful study, studies plural, that make me very confident that our initial plan worked. So we do the best we can with what we know, and we know when we know better, we do better, but change demands courage to think differently. Change is not easy, but in order to have socially just assessment, I think that really requires self-reflection. You know, like, okay, what am I doing? And self-correction. I really need to choose something new, and something not just new, but something I know works better because I've seen the research that it's a better way. And I'll just end with this. I love this quote from Martin Luther King: make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You'll make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of our country. And a world So that's where I'll stop.
Well, Jack, let me jump in here at this point. Quite honest with you, I want to start with this. I got you. I got you. You see, and just for our audience, Jack and I have had these conversations already. So Jack knows what's coming a little bit of where the conversation is going. But, you at the very beginning and really throughout, the big ideas that you presented there, Jack, you talk a lot about knowledge and measuring knowledge as opposed to measuring intelligence or cognitive processing. I'm just wondering, why is measuring knowledge so problematic when we're talking about cognitive processing?
That's really a key point, right? Think about the differential access to high quality education. We know that certain populations in our country don't have the best education, to be quite honest. We know that some portions of our country, some people have tremendous amount of opportunity, tutors, after school, summer, study. Is unequal acquisition of knowledge is what's driving the differences in these intelligence tests. And really, the really bad part about that is it's, as American Psychological Association recently apologized for the role psychology has played in creating an environment of racism, those results have been used to describe people when really the results were about the tests themselves, and that the tests were not equitable, not that the people were really that different. And that's what the 3 studies that I just showed you really say. That's the real message. The real message is we have been misled into thinking that people, groups of people, are not as smart because of their skin tone. And that's because there was too much confidence in these tests that were made 100 years ago. And of course, in that time period, remember, people like Terman was a racist, people like Cattell was a racist, objected to Brown versus Board of Ed, objected to the civil rights movement. There was a lot of, we can talk about all that, and I'm sure Byron and others will talk about that, but just, this is really the fundamental problem in these tests, and the impact of it is so profound and troublesome.
So Jack, let me kind of, I want to split that into 2 parts, because here we're talking about knowledge, measuring knowledge, and how many of our more popular, let's say, intelligence tests in part measure knowledge. And what I'm hearing you say is that that's problematic because we're not really measuring cognitive processing, or we're not really measuring intelligence by measuring knowledge. We're essentially measuring what people have been exposed to, or what they've been taught, what they maybe have learned or not learned in school. And so that's not really cognitive processing. That's not intelligence. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And keep in mind, the tests that we most often use for identification of gifted children were never developed on any theory of intelligence. Just stop and think about that for a second. Just think about, shouldn't you have a test that has some kind of, theory behind it? It would make sense to better understand it. And that's why I think in our field, there's so many wild interpretations of what all these tests measure. And people talk about verbal intelligence, right? Well, why call it verbal intelligence? It's just a vocabulary test, right? That's a confounding factor. When we want to measure intelligence, we need to measure thinking in a way that doesn't matter. Like, for example, if I gave you the original Binet Well, if you and I took the original Binet, we would be really looking bad because it's in French. So that's the problem. You know, if I gave when I was learning the ways, if I gave it to my grandfather, he would say, I no speak any English, right? And he would not get a good score. Just like the Native American Navajo children that I had in my study in 1982, the very first study where I started my work in the area of equitable assessment, when I objected to the verbal scale being used as a measure of intelligence for Navajo children. And I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense. Yesterday, I met with some students from Tufts University. They asked just to chat with me, and I was happy to do that. And this first year student said to me, I gave the WAIS I gave the WISC for this student, but why is there an information subtest on that? And why is there vocabulary? And I said to her, you know, you need to trust your gut, because you're right, it shouldn't be there.
So, you know, as school psychologists, we think about, you know, what are we really measuring? What are we trying to figure out about the students? And if we're, you know, truly trying to measure that cognitive processing, how they're processing information, how they're taking in information from their environment, you're essentially saying we shouldn't be measuring knowledge. We shouldn't be measuring what they may have learned. But I want to ask you, Jack, kind of about the second part of what you were speaking about before, and you kind of alluded to some of this in the big ideas. When you talked about test bias and kind of statistical test bias versus equity in the questions, I think this is a really important kind of distinction to make. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of share just a little bit more. How can a test be not biased statistically, but still be inequitable?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So on my shelf over here, I have a book that's about this thick. It's called Bias and Mental Testing. And then I have several other books that are all on psychometric theory, Nunnally and Bernstein and others. Volumes and volumes of books and methodologies have been written and methodologies used to evaluate test bias. But what does that really mean? Like, what exactly do they do? Well, they look at, for example, how the various subtests are intercorrelated. How do all of these 8 or 10 or 12, however many subtests you have, how are they all correlated? Meaning, to get a high score on one, you get a high score on the other. What we would look at to look at test bias would be differential predictions. So you look at regression curves. The Potoff technique was one that we used many years ago. Now there's a lot of other diff analysis. There's all kinds of ways of studying how the inner workings of a test go together without getting into the real psychometric explanations, right? And when someone says to you, I'm thinking of a particular person, I won't tell you who it is, but it's a very, very well-known person who was saying at a gifted conference, well, IQ tests are not biased, so they're fine to be used for identification of gifted children. And I was quite offended by that, because bias is only half of the story. A test evaluation should be based on bias, but not bias alone. It needs to be also evaluated on the basis of equity. And equity is about the content of the questions, not how the questions interrelate with one another, not about the factorial invariance of the tests. Equity is about the simple, straightforward analysis. What does the student need to know to answer the question? Versus how does the student have to think? If you are answering the question that they have to know X, Y, and Z, it's a confounded measure of thinking. And this distinction is one that's in the standards for educational and psychological tests. I didn't make this up. It's in the documentation. You can go and read it. And we, again, need to know about these really esoteric concepts in order to make a very practical decision about which test to choose.
Okay, so I hear you. I think our audience hears you on that. Let's talk a little bit about gifted education, because that's really where I want to focus this evening, on talking about assessment for gifted programs, access to enriched programs for all students. I guess if we can start with the basis, Jack, for those that may not be familiar with assessment for gifted programs, can you kind of give us a brief overview of what that generally looks like? What are we looking for oftentimes we engage in assessment for these programs?
Okay, that's a really great question. And the answer is there's a tremendous amount of diversity. And I've presented at most National Association of Gifted Children's Conference since like the mid 80s or late 80s. And I often ask, well, so what is your procedure? What do you do? And usually people say, well, we have a collection of methods that we apply. And, examination of grades or portfolios, sometimes like a verification in some states, that's the way it is, screen, verify, but they'll verify with a whisk. So they wonder why they don't have kids apply, right? Some school districts use a combination of things that some are good, but they don't really know if they work or not because it's very informal. I'll tell you one school district in particular actually became quite well known because it led to a court case. U46 Elgin, Illinois, 42% of the district is Hispanic. 2% of the kids in gifted are Hispanic. Sounds like something's wrong there. What did they use? According to the expert who defended the procedure used by the district, they used a variety of tools, including the COGAT and the verbal and quantitative scores, and they used my Naglieri nonverbal. But they only let kids in even if the kids had high scores on my nonverbal test, they also had to have high scores on the verbal and the quantitative. In other words, high achieving kids.
Right.
The judge also listened to Dr. Donna Ford from Ohio State, a friend and colleague of mine for decades. And she helped the judge understand exactly what it means to be smart. She actually showed the judge one of my tests. And I think it's just so funny. She reported how the judge said, I'm a district court judge. I don't know the answer to this question. If these kids can get these right, they deserve being gifted. and actually the judge clearly explained that the problem was how they did the analysis of all the tests, that they ignored the nonverbal tests, and the judge ruled that the district intentionally discriminated against the students, and he disqualified the other expert testimony.
Wow.
You don't want that to happen.
Certainly powerful. So what I'm hearing you say, Jack, is really when we look at entrance to gifted programs or enriched programs within districts, we may use a portfolio, but usually part of that is using some type of standardized instrument, whether it be part of the screening or part of the confirmation process that kids have to go through. And although they may use certain instruments, such as you had mentioned this court case, if part of that whole battery or the requirement is based upon inequitable or tests that result in equitable findings, that's problematic, right?
Right. So think of it this way. What we really need to have equity in gifted is evaluating students using measures that are equitable so that we find gifted students, regardless of whether they're talented. most of the time we're finding the talented kids. Talented meaning academically advanced. But there are these million of students out there who are really smart and they don't get nominated for a gifted program by the teacher because they're not reading too well, or they're not really they're kind of acting out because they're like, I don't want to do this stuff, it's stupid, but no one knows how smart they are, and they don't come to school looking nice and dressed up, and they're struggling and they're poor. They may not speak English very well, but they're really, really smart. Give them a chance, for crying out loud.
So Jack, let me just ask you a really obvious question. I mean, if we are using instruments that have different outcomes for different racial groups, what does that really mean for children of color and their ability to access these programs?
Yeah, what I often think, what we're doing, or not us, but what's happening is we're alienating the smartest kids in the school. And you know what that happens, because they're so damn smart, they get around all the rules, they become, whatever they become. Hopefully they become, brilliant when they get out of school and where they can excel on a job, right? But we're really disenfranchising, and we're demeaning people. I think a lot of people's view of themselves comes out of their view of how they were as a student.
Mm.
And if you're a C+ student, you think, I must not be that smart. And if you don't get a really high GRE or an ACT or a PSAT, we often confuse academic knowledge with smartness, and they're actually related but different. All about opportunity.
Jack, we've been doing this for a long time. Give me your thoughts on why are we still doing it this way? I mean, I gotta be honest, I'm sitting here and again, you and I have had these conversations and I still don't have a good answer. Why are we still doing it this way?
Well, yeah, how many decades have I been having, how many research papers, how many tests I made along these lines? I mean, a lot of them. I see more change, and I feel that there's more change lately, but there's still pushback. So here's what people will say. Well, the verbal tests are really important because they have good validity. And I say, well, what do you mean by good validity? Well, they correlate really strongly with achievement. I'm like, dude, they got the same questions in both tests. What do you expect? Come on, let's be, honest about it. You want to predict, you want to correlate with achievement? Do it with a test that doesn't have achievement in it. That's the real challenge, right? And then the schools will say, well, we give the WISC. Okay, we give the COGAT. All right, how's that working for you? Well, they know it's not working, so why do they keep doing it? Is that implicit racism? I don't know, John. I don't know. I can tell you that sometimes I've had teachers say to me, I'm not a remedial reading teacher. I said, the kid's got 141 IQ score on my test. You don't want to teach that kid how to read? What a pleasure that would be to teach a brilliant person like that how to read and do math and everything else they can do anything. Why would you not want to teach them? Why do you just want to have the kids who already come in, they're already reading, and they're just a pleasure to work with? Well, they are, that's great. But why would you exclude those who don't look like you think a gifted kid looks like?
So, Jack, what do we have to do different? I want to get to some of the questions from our audience tonight, but what's your perspective on what we need to be doing differently?
Well, we as psychologists have to advocate for a proper, appropriately equitable assessment for everybody. Because remember, it's everybody. It's that poor white kid who lives in Southern Ohio that I tested many years ago, who saw a book once or twice before he got to school, right? It's anybody, but it's mostly these kids that we've denied access, the kids of color, the ELL kids, the brilliant people out there that we say, no, if you're not academically talented, you know, you don't belong in gifted. Gifted needs to change. Conceptualization needs to change. And the people need to, and you know, the other thing is, my colleague Dina Brias and I were talking just this morning because we're preparing for our presentation at the California Gifted Conference this weekend. She said, you know, Jack, 86% of teachers are white women. Who do you think they choose? When someone says, do you have any gifted kids that you want to be tested for the gifted program, right? One of the ways to do it is to do universal testing, which means you test everybody, not by nomination. Not by nomination by the teacher, by the parent, or anybody else. You test everybody. Everybody in like second grade or first grade, they all get tested. Like with my 3 tests, you do that and you're going to find the smart kids. And it won't be what you would find if you gave every one of those kids a whisk. Absolutely won't be. And I show you the data why already.
Okay.
Or a COGAT or an OLSAT, which is more likely they're going to be used. You're going to get different people.
So for those of us that may want to continue this conversation or bring the messaging back to our districts, we have some special ed administrators on the conversation today. Others might be listening on demand. You know, who needs to hear this message, Jack? In your experience in going out to school districts and going to conferences and doing the research, who needs to hear this message?
I think that the most important person is probably the administrators who are responsible for the programs, but also the people who are actually in the running the programs, and eventually the teachers themselves. Because look, it's going to require that teachers teach differently. And in my new book that's going to publish in October, the one on using the 3 tests that I mentioned, we have tremendous amount of information for teachers, by teachers, of what you do with these students. How do you teach them? Dina Brias has a wonderful section in our book about the cluster grouping and differentiated instruction, and Kim Lansdowne has tremendous valuable information about the workings. How are you going to make this work? What are you going to do? Okay, this kid doesn't read and this kid is reading, 5 grade levels above. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to manage it? All that kind of stuff. It really needs to be several layers of people in each school district. And I think we already have people using our test, by the way, and it's amazing, the response to it. Absolutely amazing, because people see it.
Actually, we just got a comment in the chat box here. I'll get to it in a moment. That talks about using your instrument. We'll get to that in a moment. But what I'm hearing you say is that we really have to look at this from a systems level, and recognize that, it's really understanding the issues and the problems with some of the instruments that we're currently using now. And how they may not be statistically biased, but they're inequitable in the outcomes of using those instruments, and how that is impacting many of our children of color. And our children of color are not accessing these enriched programs, which we know are valuable for moving them forward, allowing them to thrive, or allowing them to continue to grow. I think that that's such a critical piece. So I have an ask for you, Jack. I'm going to ask for you, if you can, put together some resources for our attendees that we can send out. But before I ask you that, can you give kind of some resources, give something to those that are listening that want to carry this conversation forward, that want to engage in maybe some advocacy around this issue?
Well, the easiest place to go is my website, the Naglieri Gifted Tests website.
Okay.
And there's a tremendous amount of information there, videos with Kim and Dina and I video presentations that we've given, hour-long sessions. There's a lot of information there. That's the place to go. And also, you have my email. So if you're a director of gifted and you want to talk to me, just send me a message. We'll talk. And if it would be helpful to have Dina and Kim and I, all three of us, chat with you about what needs to be done. We're doing that already with a lot of places. We're happy to continue to do that.
So you heard it here. And I'm going to tell you, Jack means that. He's given out his email address, and you can contact him personally. I know for some people that might seem intimidating or inappropriate, but Jack genuinely means that. I think it's probably how we first connected years and years ago, was through one of those contacts and one of those outreach that are there. So we have some resources that are available. Certainly for those. And I would absolutely encourage you. In fact, I would say to you in many ways, and Jack and I just had this conversation recently, that it really represents an ethical responsibility for school psychologists to engage in this work. We know within our ethical standards that this is part of the work that we need to be doing. So beyond just being the right thing to do for kids and making sure all kids have equitable access to these programs, we have an ethical standard to really follow through on this and be aware of these issues. And once we're aware of it, and I love what you said before, Jack, once you're aware of the issue, a good friend of ours, Peter Faustino, often says, once you hear it, it's hard not to hear anymore. So we're aware of the issues. We need to do something about it. And I think that that's important. These hours always go by so quickly, and we're close to the end, but we do have a number of comments, questions within the chat that I want to try and get to. Usually invite our good friend George back. I know George was having some internet issues. You with us, George?
I'm here.
Okay.
Seem to have
So,
survived.
George, I'm going to field some of the questions in the chat and kind of walk through a few with you, Jack. But I'm glad that you made it through, George, and back with us.
So we've got a number of questions here, starting with Robin Chotner. I'm not sure how to say that, but she asked, the verbal component of this test with the pictures is similar in style to the WISC-5 picture concepts subtest, which is considered a nonverbal test. Can you please help clarify that?
Okay, so whenever you look at test questions, remember, you have to ask, what does the student need to know to answer the question? A lot of the items on the picture concepts demand knowledge. That's not the way our test works. And it's not, you can't just go by, like a cursory look at the actual items. You have to look at all of them and understand what kind of knowledge they may require. So it's a really good question. And it's one of those things that's subtle and a little tricky, actually. I learned this a long time ago with looking at progressive matrices. Even a nonverbal progressive matrices can be based on knowledge. Not the ones that I write, but on the Ravens, they are.
So let me just make sure I hear you correctly on that, because this is actually, I think, a very important point. It's not so much verbal versus nonverbal. Is the question is it based upon knowledge? Is that accurate?
Exactly right. Like the Fibonacci series example that I gave, right? If you don't know what a Fibonacci series is, you wouldn't recognize it. But if you know what a Fibonacci series is, you see it right away. So that changes the probability of getting the item correct because of knowledge. Simple as that. And the same thing with all the WISC-5 picture concepts. You'd have to look at all the items and figure out exactly what is driving it. If it's some nuance or what. Even the nonverbal, even the matrices on the Webster scales were also like that. They were, well, I could talk about that another time.
Well, maybe we're
Jack, we have a question.
Jack.
I'm sorry, go ahead, George.
I was just going to say, maybe we're going to have Jack come back to talk about that very thing.
Yeah. Be happy to.
Jack, we did have a question regarding when talking about the analysis, any analysis done by SES that you've done.
Well, yes, remember the 3 studies I showed you, and we had parental ed levels, and we didn't have differences across parental ed level. that parental ed is, often used as a socioeconomic status variable.
Okay. And second part of that question, Diane was asking, has there been any other research done outside of your group that you conducted versus someone outside of your group conducting research on your instrument?
On the 3 new tests, I didn't
Yes.
do the research.
Okay.
It was done by the research scientists at MHS. So
Excellent. Okay.
it's more than arm's length, let me put it that way.
So go ahead if you want to do the next one, George.
Yeah, Rochelle Thiessen has the question. Love this topic. In terms of equitable, culturally responsive gifted assessment, are there some go-tos that are recommended? Currently, our district administers the WISC-5 as default and the KABC-2 NU for culturally and linguistically diverse students. We're currently considering ordering the RIAS. Now that I know better, I want to help guide our district to do better. Thank you.
Okay, that's a great question. So, you know how I feel about the WISC. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. If you want the most culturally fair test, I already showed you what that was. That's the cognitive assessment system on that slide that shows the differences by race and ethnicity. And it's more equitable than the KBC, way more equitable than the WISC.
And really looking at that as an equitable practice, making sure we're getting all students and not, as I said before, by nomination, by some other potentially biased. It could be an implicit bias, not intentionally leaving kids out, but certainly we know that, our perceptions are influenced by those implicit biases. And so teachers, we know, and there's plenty of research behind this, do have implicit bias. So that universal screening is a valuable way to go about doing that.
Yeah, just to clarify, there's a really important question that Robin asked about is like the 3 tests that we have, they're not screeners. The 3 tests are actually 3 points of data that you should use to make a decision about a student. It's just that when you do it, and when you test everybody, and you have a group administered online or even paper, but online group administered test, that's the most efficient way to do it. And it's not like, because if you think about a screen, I usually think of something that has not really much quality. It's quick and dirty, as someone might say, right? But whether you use the Naglieri nonverbal ability test or use the Naglieri general ability test, the 3, or just some combination thereof, those are data points, not just the screening.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important piece that we make a distinction. We're talking about gifted education and evaluation for the gifted or enriched programs within districts. And that's what really you're focusing on with this particular instrument. There are other instruments out there looking, at full scale cognitive processing, things of that nature. I know you mentioned the CAS too before, things of that. So
yeah, that was
all
one
right.
of the tests on that slide that has all the race and ethnic differences, and it's on the bottom for a reason, because small differences.
So this is a huge topic, and it really branches into equitable assessment practices in general within school psychology. I think we may take George up on that offer to maybe come back and have another broader conversation, about equitable practices within our assessment practices, beyond just gifted education.